So you were very little when your uncle Howard died, and when did you decide that you would do such a film, and how long did it take? Because reconstructing all this and even the films that were kind of lost must have been such a job and an effort.
Yeah, it was a very big job. I mean, I wanted to make movies from the time I was 6. I was on the set of Bloodhounds of Broadway, and I loved it so much. But to actually be able to do a film on Howard really kind of organically grew out of wanting to discover his lost films, and in particular the Burroughs film. And I remember even just the initial emails to try to find out where a Burroughs print or negative had gone stirred up so many fresh stories, from Brad Gooch, James Grauerholtz, John Giorno, Jim and Sarah, and it was so ripe with interesting material that right away it started to trigger ideas about who Howard was beyond the scope of just an uncle. And then once we started to continue to look, everywhere we were finding a clue, it was attached to someone who knew a completely different Howard in a completely different space, and it really just started to grow to the point where we were finding things and connecting with people who were really extraordinary in their own right and had very interesting insights into Howard and his times that, we decided, let's try to turn this process, this discovery that is actually happening in real time, into a film.
Mm-hmm. But at the beginning, you knew mostly Jim and Sarah, but many people came after. And how did you join all this stuff and then started to do the editing? How long did it take?
Well, start to finish, it took about 4.5 years. Mm-hmm. It was very difficult.
Mm-hmm. But at the beginning, there were many people who didn't even know. They came because someone spoke of them, and then.
Yeah, things would continue to pop up. I mean, I knew Jim and Sarah, and I knew people like Brad Gooch and family. Some people I had met, like Daryl Pinkney, but didn't really know very well. But the search kind of continued to evolve, and yes, one clue would lead to something else, or we would find out that Frederick Mitterrand wrote a memoir, and in that memoir there's a whole chapter entitled Howard Brookner, and then boom, Howard in Paris, kind of appears or emerges, or Kim Massey. Kim Massey was through Sarah Driver, who knew that Howard had a girlfriend. So these things just kind of kept growing out of the search, and it was about trying to, on the one hand, capture that search in real time, that freshness to it, and also the physical labor of gathering his archive and assembling his archive and putting that together, because that was very difficult to find. 16mm film is great, but in 2000 whatever, to actually digitize it and sync it is a massive challenge.
But in your film there are, let's say, many films. This is also the story of a certain age in New York. Then the story and the films of your Uncle Howard, the relationship all these people had. They were quite a brilliant generation. All from them, Sarah mentions them, and they all worked kind of together.
Yeah, I think it was very collaborative, and there was a real kind of sense of family and of helping each other that really came across quite clearly in the way they worked, from Burroughs or Ginsberg to Jim and Howard to Howard and his other peers, and that was a very beautiful thing about how they were working. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Paula, was it a difficult film to produce?
All films are difficult to produce. Was it a difficult film to produce? Well, it depends. I mean, at times it was very difficult, but it was a very pleasant film as well. It's always been a film full of joy in the discovery, in the working with people. Like it was a luxury as well, if you like, to have people like Jim and Sarah, but also people like, I don't know, Catherine Dickman, who's also a great filmmaker from the time who knew Howard, who was giving us editing notes, or Tom DiCillo, who came to look at grading. And so it was difficult because these days, I mean, for an independent producer, we always start from scratch. We start from nothing, and we have to believe in this thing that one day is going to materialize, and we go around asking for money, asking for so many things. And I remember early on, like some pitching forums that I would go to alone. Some were very tough. And I remember one, it stayed with me. Somebody said, so you want some money for this filmmaker to do like on-screen therapy? Of course, I didn't get any money from that forum. And I remember thinking, that's horrible. Like, if somebody thinks that that's what we want the money for. So clearly that was not the place. But so people don't really know what you're trying to do. Oh, you want to do a film because it's your uncle, they would say to Aaron. And until you can really prove the value of what you have, but also what you want to tell, it becomes difficult, especially when there were so many people involved with certain names. Oh, is this like a name-dropping type of project? So it was a very difficult project in that way. We knew, Aaron, myself, the closest people to the film, the family, as we call it now, Howard's family, we really knew what the film was about. Then we had to find the shape, and Aaron had to explore that himself as a director. But I think it was really deep in our hearts, and it was very difficult to explain as a producer.
I was wondering, given that you knew him for a short period of your life, I was wondering what was some of the biggest discoveries that you made about your uncle, some of the biggest surprises in getting to know him in this way?
Well, there are so many. I mean, on the micro and the macro. I mean, on the micro scale, he wrote a porno book with William Burroughs. I didn't know that. He stayed in a love hotel by accident with Bianca Jagger and Bob Wilson in Tokyo. You know, things like that would pop up.
The David Bowie one is good.
Yeah, we found out that he had been working on developing a project with David Bowie before he died, which would have been awesome to see. So there are so many little things like that. But also on the macro scale, I mean, when I was a kid and he died at 34, he was buried on his 35th birthday, that seemed very old to me, you know. It didn't seem like such a big deal, what he had managed to accomplish by that age. And now, obviously, it's not so old to me. And I'm even more impressed, you know, really by what he was able to accomplish. I mean, to make a film that makes sense to an audience on William Burroughs is really extraordinary. And to navigate that world and make sense of it, and then go and do the same thing with Robert Wilson, who is really equally as complex, but very different than William Burroughs. And then to go from these two things to making a fiction film, and his first film with a studio behind him, and, you know, Madonna and Jennifer Grey turning down parts after Dirty Dancing to do Bloodhounds. You know, his ability to navigate all these different worlds and find his voice within it is really kind of extraordinary. And it extends to his personal life. I mean, we were joking, as we were finding, you know, all these different people, we realized nobody knew the same Howard. He was different to everybody, but he was always the same Howard somehow, which is really very special, to always be yourself in different scenarios. And that was a real gift. So that was kind of an amazing, big discovery of who he was.
As a producer, it was a great discovery to see all the contracts that he had done. He was really savvy. He knew a lot about what he wanted and how he wanted, and he was doing the contracts himself. So I was reading them. We found some different versions of contracts, how he would make notes and what he would change. I really found that personally fascinating, among a ton of things about him as a person. But coming from the producer question before.
But this film on Burroughs he made while he was still at school.
He started it.
Yeah, he started as his NYU thesis project
Jim.
with Jim, basically. And actually, Sarah was working in the equipment room with Spike Lee, checking out their gear. And their first trip was that shoot out in Colorado and then in the Nova Convention. And then it just started to expand. And I know that Howard got slammed by the the teachers at NYU who thought this was just this crazy shit he was doing with a junkie who murdered his wife and didn't really understand. And it continued to grow, over the course of 4 years.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that film, and I'm curious. One thing that I got out of it, was so interesting to listen to and get a glimpse into his process as a filmmaker. And so I'm curious, as a filmmaker, what have you learned from him?
Well, an immense amount, but I would say one of the things that was really apparent, even before we actually got the film out of the bunker, the film archive of Burroughs, I had gone to Kansas and got the safety sound rolls, a 1/4-inch tape that he had. So I just had audio, like 30 hours of audio. I was just listening to it. And I could hear how much fun he was having. I mean, his excitement for making a film was really contagious, and Burroughs was having fun, and the crew was having fun, but also very respectful and serious about what they were doing. But that kind of energy, that kind of excitement, was really exciting to see because, I think we kind of start out making films very excited about it, and then there's just so many obstacles that will get thrown your way all the time. And we had a ton of obstacles making this film, whether it was John in the beginning, but that's what's on screen, but there's so many more. But I would kind of return to that, kind of those early sound recordings of how much fun this was to remind myself how privileged you are to be able to turn on a camera, be in control of where you want to focus it, tell the story you want to tell. And, as a director, then that kind of energy is what you're kind of giving the most to the story, to the film, and it becomes contagious. And then everyone kind of builds off of that, and you see that in his work to get Burroughs to open up the way he did. I mean, he would never do that. And the same thing with Bob Wilson. I mean, Bob Wilson, Daryl Pinckney told me, Daryl works with Bob a lot. He said, Bob doesn't talk. He doesn't talk. To get him to open up is really extraordinary. And so I think it's that, it's that fun.
I'm very intimidated now because the microphone took so long to arrive that the question needs to be worthy. 2 questions. One, how, Paula, did you come to the project as a producer? I'm just curious for that. And then also for you, whether you're going to carry on filmmaking. I don't know what you were doing before.
I produced Darren's first film as well, which was a very guerrilla type film, black and white. We did it just for iPad, like some sort of experiment. And then we continued doing things together. We are married also. So this film was kind of in the family, in the heart of the family. We couldn't really go away from it, even if we wanted. We were doing another film, in fact. We were starting to think about Aaron's following film after that experiment. Aaron was trying to find the Burroughs film, and the whole situation with Sarah Driver and Aaron talking about it, and when that process happened, we both found a letter, like the letter that you see in the film, that talks about Howard. That letter says, don't really cry for me. You don't be sad that I die, because I'm gonna live in my films. So we both thought, the films are not really there, and so it was more than just the Burroughs film. Not only his films are not there, but Howard is not there. So how to transform, as Aaron was saying, all that search that was taking really long into the story. And I'm producing his next film as well. So I think I'm stuck with this guy. You can talk about your next film if you like.
Oh yeah, the next film. I have a gun to her head, so she has to. But yeah, I'm doing a fiction film called Black Deutschland, which was written by Daryl Pinckney, who's in the film. And he wrote a very beautiful book that came out this past year about a young man who goes from Chicago to live in West Berlin in the 80s. And it's very closely based on Daryl's experience. And Daryl is one of the people who I knew a bit as a kid, but didn't know very well, and got to know him quite well making this film. So that's the next project.
First of all, it's an amazing work what you have done, but I have 3 questions which made me think about. The first one is about the bunker. It took you a lot of time until you reached the material, until you got, let's say, the permission to reach it. The second one is different clues have been created, and there was a moment that you reached the archive in Hamburg. How did you come to Hamburg? My third curiosity goes, there is a part in the movie where Uncle Howard is talking about the death of his grandfather and about the ring. At that moment, death for him is something very sad. There is a moment he says, well, when you have a long life and you die, you don't really need to be so sad about it. But when you are younger, that's different. Later on in the movie, the scenario is different. It seems that his idea of dying young is not so negative as it was before. Did you have anything in mind, or was that to reach the viewer when you selected that image before, or it was just by casuality that it came in your mind?
Which question should I start with? Maybe that one. No, the video diaries were very poignant, and I looked at them as, Howard shot them with the same way that he shot film, as in he wasn't just rolling. There was a reason why he was turning on the camera and recording this particular moment. And you're absolutely right, that was his first questioning of death when his grandfather died, and considering that kind of mortality. And in a way, I kind of viewed it as, that's like a decision that he's got to make then, and what's he going to do with his time? And I think he chose to make his big film, make the big work. At the detriment maybe of a prolonged existence. And I think I'm sure he would have liked to live and make more films. But if he could die saying those words, I think that was very kind of meaningful. He did get to do exactly what he wanted to do. And in the face of death and a terrible disease, he decided not to kind of curl up and hide under the covers. He decided to go out and make his most ambitious film to date. And I think that does show a lot of courage and was inspiring, and also his way of dealing with the illness and not being a victim to it, which I thought was powerful. And I did not want this film to end in something so depressing, and that was one of the challenges in the edit, was getting that balance right, because once you get into Howard's story, it's very easy for it to become about his story, but then how does it end? It ends in death, and it's just really sad. And it wasn't what this story was fully about, and wasn't what Howard was fully about. He was full of life, and he gave everyone so many gifts from his life that we took from it. So it was about trying to, channel that energy in the story. So that's why.
I think it's worth pointing that we feel from what we timed on the archives that the first diary that you hear him talking about death and reflecting on somebody dying young and being sad about it might be very close to the time that he found out he was HIV positive. And the other one that you see at the end is like he already knows he has it, and he, is really dealing with death, and he wants to deal with it in a very uplifting way. And I think Aaron was really, very much into trying to reflect that, the way Howard himself felt about death. And that's also what happens in those two archives. They're timed with Howard's way to see death himself. So how did you get to Hamburg?
I drove from London. No, it was very weird because we were searching, and Bob Wilson had told me that they had a lot of outtakes. Howard had shot a ton of stuff while they were traveling around. And then finally we were able to locate it in this archive, and they wrote us this kind of short email saying we have 236 boxes of schnitzel.
Yeah, but credit where credit is due. We had, early on, the film had someone who was going to co-produce the film with us who was in Germany, that then became just a person who collaborated with the film, like a service provider more than a co-producer. So Klaus Mack, and he produced other films around that era. He did a famous film called Decoder, and Klaus helped us trace and track a lot of the material in Germany in general, and then specifically got to Hamburg with his help as well. And the first one was about the bunker. What was the question? Sorry. What was the question exactly? How long did it take to get the stuff out? Like a year and a half, 2 years around. Yeah. It's just a snippet in the film, but it was a long process. And that was also his decision not to make that that fight about that fight, like the film about that fight. It was really more like, okay, we had this obstacle. Here is the resolution. So let's move on to what we need to do. Otherwise, it will become another film, kind of like more TV. Like the guy doesn't want to let me in, and here comes the lawyer, and here comes.
How did you choose the soundtrack?
Ooh.
Yeah, the soundtrack.
Credit where credit is due.
Yeah, well, it was a mix of a lot of things, but also we were very lucky to work with Barry Hogan from All Tomorrow's Parties, and I didn't want to do a soundtrack that was like right on, like this song that we're using, because this is from 1986 or whatever, and it was more just about emotive music that seemed to fit his story correctly. And early on in the process, we had been making kind of music experiments with audio and just kind of abstract imagery, and these things kind of stuck. And Barry was great also because he has a great ear and love for music that sounds kind of cinematic. So like, for example, we were at their Mogwai show in London that they were putting on, and they were doing as an encore My Father, my hymn, the song that we use in the Bloodhounds. And Barry turned to me and says, "You have to use this song in Bloodhounds because Howard's Jewish." So we're like, okay. We'll do it.
We actually wanted originally we wanted Carter Logan to be part of that process, who's a great friend, a musician as well. But then Carter was doing 2 films at the same time, and he delivered Barry Hogan very kindly as a friend, and then Barry became the person. But the actual story will have to go back to even that original idea. It's true.
And Fred Schindler too. We had an amazing music supervisor.
Oh yes, our
because
music supervisor.
I think I gave them probably the biggest nightmare of a soundtrack to clear. How many songs were there?
32. I think we ended up like cutting it at some points at 29 in the end. I don't know, but I remember at some point there were 32.